If you write articles or copy, or even work as an editor for a magazine, you're going to want to listen to this advert. Are you looking to save time writing online content? Well, Phosphor AI is an online service that will save you hours of work with your content creation. All you have to do is type in your title, and their AI software will get to work writing a high-quality original article just for you. You'll need to review the article and take 15 to 20 minutes to make necessary edits, but then the piece will be ready for publishing. Just for signing up, you'll get 3 free articles so you can try out Phosphor AI and see what it can do all for yourself. Why waste time writing online content yourself when you can get Phosphor AI to do it for you? Try out their service today and see just how much time you can save. That's Phosphor AI. Go to phosphorai.com. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I have the pleasure to be joined all the way from Ukraine by John Sweeney, author of In The Kremlin, amongst other books, host of Talking Sweeney, sorry, did you just say?
Sweeney Talks.
Sweeney Talks.
Sweeney never shuts up.
Well, I mean, isn't that what the best journalists do these days? That, you know, you have to be loud in order to get your point across, I think, with the internet.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so, and also reporter on the fantastic documentary with Byline TV, Compromat, which I really enjoyed, actually. Give me a good excuse to sign up for Byline TV. And there's way more on there than I realized, so maybe I'll keep it. There's some really interesting stuff on there. Looking forward to the Brexit documentary a lot. Let's start with Compromat. It was incredible to me that this story, both incredible and totally believable, that this story has not been widely covered, or that there's been very few questions actually asked of Evgeny Lebedev and his father, and his ownership of the Evening Standard and the Independent. What do you think he wants with them? Is it like a profit, or is there something more sinister at work here?
Well, that's a very good question, Josh. And we don't know the answer, but it's an important question to ask, and far too many people in the mainstream media establishment, etc., have not had the wit to ask that question. So, for people who haven't watched Compromat, and it's on the Byline TV website, have a go. I think it costs £2 to watch, which is less than the price of a coffee in London. What it looks at is a strange, funny, peculiar relationship between Boris Johnson and the Lebedevs. Now, the one you may have heard more about is Evgeny Lebedev, who is Baron Siberia. And there's a hint there in the name that something's slightly amiss. So he's now a member of the House of Lords, which is still part of our parliament. And he's a lawmaker, therefore he has the power to say what he wants and to vote whatever he wants. And what's interesting about him is not him. In fact, he's more of child than man. He once got an interview with President Lukashenko, the tyrant of Belarus, and the BBC, he managed to get this, sort of BBC went along and filmed it, and they sent a friend of mine, Natalia Antelava, who was kind of reporting on Lebedev's reporting, a rather strange, peculiar thing. And at one point, Evgeny Lebedev, the man who is now Baron Siberia, asks Lukashenko what's his view on group sex, which is weird and peculiar. And even Lukashenko was, what are you talking about? So this is a very weird playboy. But his father, Alexander Lebedev, was a KGB spy in London from 1988 to 1992. And the Ukrainians say that the KGB is like Hotel California. You can check out any time you want, but you can never, ever leave. So, and by the way, Putin says this. The Russians call secret police, the people who were in the KGB, new name FSB, there are other organizations, but let's just call it the Russian secret police. And the nickname for them is the Checker, which comes from the Extraordinary Commission, which is what Lenin's secret police was called back in 1917, the Checker. And what Putin has said is, once a Chekist, always a Chekist. So you can't get a higher authority on the Russian secret police than Vladimir Putin. And therefore, that raises an enormous question about Alexander Lebedev. Now, let's remember that when Boris Johnson celebrated his December 2019 election victory, he did so at the house of Alexander Lebedev in London. And because it was Alexander's 60th birthday. So this is a very, very funny, peculiar relationship. After the Salisbury poisonings, Boris Johnson went to a NATO meeting in Brussels. And then somehow he ended up at Alexander Lebedev's palazzo in Umbria in Italy. Gorgeous place, magnificent swimming pool, blah, 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 blah. And this at the time, knowing what was inside NATO's collective mind about what response they would do to the Salisbury poisonings, was probably the number one intelligence goal for the Russian secret state. And Boris goes and stays in a palazzo owned by a former KGB colonel. Hello? What's that about? It's very, very concerning. Now, my friend Christopher Steele, who remember was the former MI6 officer who was in charge of what we call the Russia House, which is what they call the Russia House, or basically the part of MI6 that looks at Russia. He was in charge of it. Then he left, and he set up as in corporate intelligence, doing reports on people doing due diligence, and he did a report on Donald Trump. And this is the famous Trump dossier. So Christopher Steele says that nobody with a proper degree of power has properly investigated another question, which is who paid for Brexit? Now, yes, for example, there has been some question marks about Britain's biggest political donation ever. That's by Aaron Banks to essentially leave the Leave campaign. And there's an awful lot of money, £8 million from Aaron Banks to the Leave campaign. There was a lot of reporting, and I did quite a bit of it, questioning where the money came from.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've quoted you in my first book, because I covered this. I wrote a book called Brexit, yes. The Establishment Civil War. So, yeah.
But what happened, I should look out for that book. What happened was that the Electoral Commission investigated and the National Crime Agency investigated, and they both cleared Aaron Banks, and Aaron Banks has denied any wrongdoing, etc., etc. So we're all clear about that. There is no story. But Christopher Steele says that neither the National Crime Agency or the Electoral Commission is competent to do this kind of investigation. I.e., you have to have the full resources of the National Security Agency, the people in Cheltenham who kind of can break enciphered emails, etc., and MI5 and MI6. They're the people who can properly investigate this question: who paid for Brexit? And that hasn't happened. Now, the reason it hasn't happened is because the Conservative Party, who are in power, have not asked for it to happen. So the question is not, did the Russian secret state help push the vote for Brexit, as they did for Trump? We all know about that because the Americans have properly investigated it. The question in Britain is, who paid for Brexit? Did the Russian secret state help the Brexit campaign? And the answer to that question is no, according to the Electoral Commission, and no, according to the National Crime Agency, although that it's a very, very narrow investigation. And then Christopher Steele says Neither of these two bodies are up for that question. They're not good enough to answer it, to do a proper investigation. Then you have within that, you have the Lebedevs, father and the son, KGB spy and playboy, and Boris Johnson goes to their parties. Now, their parties are bunga bunga parties. Anything goes. Boys, girls, drugs. I'm not talking aspirin or paracetamol. The Lebedevs deny this. I'm being careful and I'm being fair. The Lebedevs deny this, and they say that essentially people like me are Russophobic. I would reply that's entirely untrue. I love Russia. I love Russian literature, Russian drinking, Russian Russia, the whole thing. I've been in love with it most of my adult life. There's a real problem now for people like me, because I do not think that the Russian opposition has been good enough in terms of standing up to the barbarity of the war. Obviously, someone I regard as a friend, Alexei Navalny, he's in prison. So is Vladimir I've forgotten his surname, whose full surname, I know he's been poisoned twice. He's in prison. Ilya Yashin, he's in prison. And the others who stood up to Putin, Anna Politkovskaya, Natasha Estemirova, Boris Nemtsov, poisoned, then shot. So I understand how difficult it is to protest, but nevertheless, I'm upset about that the other Russia I believe in has not stood up to Putin so far. We'll see what happens. So I would say to the Lebedevs, I'm not a Russophobe. That's foolish. But there is a question mark about their relationship with Boris Johnson. And that's something which remains a question mark, and it's an unanswered question. The answer provided by the NCA and the Electoral Commission was partial, not complete.
Mm. And what you're saying about sort of the wealthiest amongst us engaging in, shall we say, crazy parties, to be generous, and using some of that material potentially for blackmail. This isn't something that I haven't heard before. So it definitely seems plausible. But like, just to play devil's advocate, like what would the Russian secret state have to benefit from the United Kingdom leaving the European Union? Like, what is there, like, because I can understand, okay, maybe it divides Europe a bit, but if anything, I would say that it seems to have united Europe, maybe against the United Kingdom in a sense, but like Europe felt a lot more united on the Brexit issue than they had been on a lot of other things. So like, what is it that the Russian secret state you think are trying to achieve here?
So the Brexit is a tragedy for Europe, for all of Europe, for Britain too. And we're seeing now, the problem was that the economic numbers were masked by COVID. And therefore, the Conservative government, could blame COVID for some of Brexit. Now that COVID's over, we can clearly see that the rest of Europe is doing very well, and it's getting back. The economies are growing, apart from Britain. And the reason Britain isn't growing is because of Brexit. So for us, it's been an economic disaster. More and more people are seeing that. The problem is that politics is actually behind ordinary people's common sense, and so that there is a kind of delay button at the moment, which is very frustrating. And in particular, Keir Starmer, I believe, has been foolish in not addressing Brexit in an honest way, and instead, what he's doing clearly is he is trying to bury it as a political issue. I think that's foolish. But the bigger question is, when we were in Europe, and there was always trouble from people like Farage, etc. However, the big picture was that we were a great benefit, in particular, that we helped balance German power and German influence in Europe. Now, remember, Germany is the richest economy by a country mile. but it is also politically still in shadow because of the legacy of Hitler. And therefore, it is, for example, over standing up to Russian fascism, it has been timid and I think too much of an appeaser, to the fury of the Poles and the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Czechs and the Slovaks and the Romanians and some Hungarians, because those peoples know what it's like to live under the fascist jackboots of the Soviet empire. Now, of course, the Soviet ideology was communist. True. But actually, if you look at it closely, from around about 1926, Russia became increasingly imperialistic and far more far right than far left, I would say. And I've written a book about this, Killer in the Kremlin, and I studied it at university a long time ago. But essentially, Russia is, or the Soviet Union, became a Russian nationalist project. And those countries who lived under, in the Warsaw Pact countries who lived behind the Iron Curtain, hated it. And Britain in the European Union was a bloody good ally. And what happened was that Brexit meant we have left the high councils of the European Union and we have made the argument weaker, the one we would be making right now if we were inside Europe. So it is a plain and positive goal for the Kremlin to break up Europe. It's simple. If you have a big wolf who is going to attack a flock of sheep, if the sheep live singly and on their own, the wolf will eat the sheep. If the sheep stick together, then the community of sheep is actually stronger than the single wolf. And what's happened is we've left and we can get picked off. And then that makes our earlier conversation even more troubling. Now that we've left, who does our British Prime Minister, the guy who, quotes, got Brexit done, Boris Johnson, who's he pal around with? A former KGB colonel and his son, Baron Siberia. Clues in the name.
Yeah. Like, honestly, I don't get why the more nationalistic elements of our press weren't, say, so we've like anointed Baron Siberia. Like, really? You know, you would have thought that the more nationalistic elements of our tabloid press would have been a tad more outraged by that.
Yeah, I would have thought so. I don't understand it. I don't understand it.
Money. Probably because they're at the same parties.
Well, they wouldn't. Well, there were some people in the media, for example, Amal Rajan, he's a brilliant presenter. He's got a lovely voice. He's from Tooting. He's a working class lad made good on him. But as a journalist, he's got no judgment. He ended up working for Evgeny Lebedev. And so there's a problem. It's one of the reasons why nobody at the BBC, for example, has investigated this story properly, is because it's embarrassing, because one of the great stars of the Today programme, Amal Rajan, was at those parties with Boris Johnson. And there is a series of issues about this. Is this good judgment? No. How can he ask questions about, for example, the Russian influence on Brexit, on British politics, if he was a beneficiary of the money of a Russian oligarch? Remember, Alexander Lebedev has been sanctioned by Canada, but not by Britain. So why have the Canadian intelligence have said, no, this man is a risk, and we're going to put sanctions on him? But the British government is not a risk because Boris parties with him. Hello, That's bad logic. If the Canadians are worried about this, man, why aren't the British? It's odd. And the anomaly troubles me greatly.
Yeah, I can see why. Anyway, I also want to. I could sit and talk with you about this all day, but I also want to talk about the war and about Kiev and sort of Russia or Ukraine on the ground. So, are you back in Kiev now?
Yeah.
So, like, what's the, I don't know, what's the feeling on the ground at the minute?
So Kyiv is. I mean, this morning there were like 13 drones, Shahed drones made by Iran, fired at the city, and none of them has caused any harm to anybody here. Now, because the Ukrainians are getting better at their air defense, they've got some good kit from the Germans. I think they're called Gepard. They're basically big machine guns, fancy machine guns, which knock these drones out of the sky. They move quite slowly, like about 150 miles an hour. They sound like mopeds, flying mopeds or doodlebugs. And they've got a pack of explosives in the nose, very cheap to make and dangerous. Now, so I'm in a city which was attacked, and every single one of these drones was knocked out of the sky, apart from one which hit a house, but the house was empty, thank God, so nobody was harmed. Having said that, I'm going to go, the restaurants are open, the bars are open, normal life goes on. You've got to leave the bar at 10 o'clock, curfew's at 11. You can't get a cab after that. So it's pretty neatly enforced by that simple problem. And there is a possibility that we all might get nuked, and there's a possibility that a cruise missile might land on your head. I've always been skeptical about the nuclear threat, and the Chinese, because essentially the Russians are afraid of the Chinese. They want to keep the Chinese as on side as possible. And the Chinese are worried about their own economy, partly because they've mishandled COVID so badly, partly because the West is finally waking up to the economic and geopolitical challenge from China.
Yeah.
And therefore, China is worried about its future, and it knows that we in the West buy far more of their stuff than the Russians do. We buy trillions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. So that effectively on the nuclear issue, China is on our side. So that I don't think the nuclear threat is high. However, the threat of being hit by a cruise missile, I was here on October the 10th, and I was here in when I arrived in my current trip in late November. I think they hit the city on the 23rd, and power went out across the city. And when the power goes out, the water goes off because you're pumping water, and so that was a big problem too. And you cannot, you can never forget the possibility that you might die because of the Russian killing machine pointed this way. It's always there in every social interaction. But you know what? It makes life really quite fun. like, hello, let's have a drink. Oh, fuck it, let's have a drink. Because it's going to be the last one ever,
Yeah.
And when I mean, George Orwell wrote in Homage to Catalonia, I think, that in war it's possible to fall in love with somebody 4 times in a day, and I think that's also true. So it gives a kind of an electricity and an excitement to life, which I don't get when I'm back in London. That's true. And there is also this real sense that Ukraine is like Britain in 1940, standing up to the Nazis, or like London, like hanging out in Kyiv is like hanging out in London in 1940, or going to or being in West Berlin in 1961, where the East German communists put up the wall. Mm-hmm. You've got this sense of being inside the city, which really, really, really believes in democracy, i.e., because people are fighting for it. People are losing their lives for democracy. People are losing their lives because they believe in the rule of law. And they believe in an open society. They believe in all of our freedoms, but they're having to fight for it. And there's something noble and magnificent about that, which is just, it's just gorgeous. So I do feel a real sense of commitment to this place, to my Ukrainian friends, who are also incredibly funny. So, like tonight, my pal Max is the guy who runs the Buena Vista, and like, you know, is he a character? Boy, is he a character. During when the Russian army was 12 miles from the center of Kyiv, martial law was installed, no alcohol. Max opened the Buena Vista. And at one point, the chief of police, Kyiv, came to Buena Vista and said, "Hey, Max, it's great that you're open." And every now and then the police would raid. And what would happen is they'd lock the front door and then you'd run out the back. I mean, fucking hell. You know, like, and I, you know, I've done that. And it's just like, that's crazy. But also kind of beautiful, you know. And yes, you know, Zelensky is he's not a comic. He's a comedic actor. But yeah, he's funny. But so is everybody else. And the Ukrainian sense of irony, it really, really reminds me of English irony, of like every conversation has sort of multiple layers. This really is a deeply civilized city. Part of the tragedy, and the country, part of the tragedy is that Russia could be like this too. And there's a moment when Putin and the secret police take over again, back in 2000 or 99. Putin's in charge. And Russia starts marching into the shadows, into its Stalinist past, starts going backwards. And at exactly the same time, Ukraine lurches uneasily and clumsily towards the future, towards an open society, towards democracy. Now you've had 2 elections which have been clean and good. And so you can feel Ukraine getting better and better. And then suddenly there's this fucking awful war. But it feels beautiful to be here. It does. I mean, I miss my family. I miss my kids, my granddaughter. I'm going to go and see them as soon as I can. But at the same time, right now, Kyiv is the most exciting city in the world to live in. Yeah, you know, and if the Russians, the other thing is Josh, the odds are very much in our favor. So October the 10th, which was, they hit Ukraine with 80 cruise missiles and 20 drones. And this is a swarm attack. So it's like Space Invaders or something like that, yeah? There isn't a way that you can that Ukrainian air defense can deal with this mass attack. 19 people were killed, but it's a city of something like, normally at peacetime there'd be 4 million. I think there's about maybe 3.5 million people here now. So the odds of dying are actually very much in your favor, which is another calculation. You know, in London you can get run over by a bus.
Trying to avoid that, although the snow made it a bit hairier, sliding people. So it's interesting that you say that you think the odds are in your favor, maybe as well as in the sense that there hasn't been like a massive amount of casualties in Kyiv comparative to the size of the population. But someone I was speaking to about this, or a couple of people actually I've spoken to about this, they're concerned that Ukraine will be left as like a smoldering shell, essentially, that however much they can throw back at the Russians, as they have pushed them back, that Russia just have the resources, and even if they don't like defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, or like, and push them back, or you know, however this resolves or ends, that the amount of outflow from Ukraine in terms of like refugees and the damage caused to the infrastructure of the country will leave it like all but inhabitable if this continues. So like what would you say to that sort of perspective?
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I don't agree with that, and I, you know, I've spent more of this year here in Ukraine than I have in London.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, the spirit of the people here is incredibly strong, and that won't happen. When there is an attack, you'll be surprised how quickly they fix things. So they put. I'm very close to Taras Shevchenko Park. They put a cruise missile which made a massive crater. You could hide a London bus in it. By the crossroads near the park, and they put another missile in the children's playground. Thank God no kids were killed. The children's playground attack, but the one of the traffic killed a number of people, including a cancer doctor, who's had a 5-year-old kid who's now an orphan because her father died, I think, fighting in the war, and her mum was killed by a Russian cruise missile. Dear God. The Ukrainian authorities fixed the crater in the road that very day, and within a week, the park was fixed. You wouldn't know. So there is a deliberate and very, very aggressive and magnificent policy of tidying stuff up very, very quickly. It's very human and the right thing to do. I remember after the awful Islamic State attack on the Westminster Bridge, the bridge was opened the very next day, and it's the same thinking, and it's the same symbolism. We're going to fix this. We're going to do something about it. We're going to fix it. And that is beautiful. And so therefore the spirit of people in Ukraine who believe in their country and believe in their future is magnificent. And that is the central argument against that. I also think it's absolutely true that at one point people used to think that Russia was the second strongest army in the world. It's now the second strongest army in Ukraine. So there is every reason for Ukrainians to feel fiercely proud of what they've achieved so far. And I'm an optimist. I mean, have a look at my book, Killer in the Kremlin. But what I do is I set out the arguments why Putin has made a terrible miscalculation. Essentially, he has thrown everything he's got, and he keeps on retreating, and he keeps on losing people. Now, because he is a fascist dictator, he doesn't care how many Russian lives are being lost in this stupid and brutal war, and the Ukrainians do care very much about their losses. However, having said that, I think it's absolutely true to say that there is going to come a point where the Russians are going to run out of the heavy metal they've been throwing at the Ukrainians, whilst the West is finally getting it. So today, for example, whatever it is, 13 drones fired at Kyiv, not a single one hurt anyone. And the Americans are now giving the Patriot air defense system. They should have done this months and months ago. But I think what's happened is the anxieties about a nuclear strike from Putin have so diminished that the scaredy cats in the Pentagon and in Westminster and in the Elysee and in the Chancellery in Berlin have now been shown to be foolish. And essentially, the Chinese have said to the Russians, no nukes. And therefore, this is a very, very winnable war. The moment the war is won, I recommend it. Everybody should come to Ukraine. They should spend their money here because these people are good and fun. And there's something beautiful about it.
Wow. I'd love to visit. I've never been to Ukraine. Poland is the furthest east I have been, and that was about a month ago. But that was beautiful. It really made me understand how people fall in love with Russia. Like just I don't know what it was. It was the architecture and the snow and the crisp cold air. And I don't know, there's something romantic about it.
Yeah, falling in love with Russia at the moment it feels wrong.
Oh, wow. I mean, the scenery.
Falling in love with Ukraine. It's even more. It's way more interesting than Poland. Anyway, I don't want to offend my Polish friends, but Ukraine is great.
So as a last question, then, because I'm aware you've got a hop here. In Game of Thrones, someone said of Littlefinger. I don't know if you've watched Game of Thrones. They said that he would burn the whole of King's Landing to the ground in order to be king of the ashes. To what extent do you think that statement applies to Putin?
I think it's true. His problem is that there are people around him who think that's stupid. So that Putin is a fragile monster. And I think he has cost Russia its good name for decades to come. He has cost Russia a fortune in treasure and money and a fortune in blood. And there will come a time when there is a reckoning, where the people around him will look at him and go, "You're a fool," and they will kill him. So the future for Putin is he leaves the Kremlin in a box. And I think that's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Well, that's quite a note, I think, to finish things on. I really, really want to thank you for your time, John. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. Is there anything you want to point people towards, like Twitter or books or anything?
Yeah, well, so if you go to Twitter, I'm at John Sweeney Raw, ROAR. I've got a Patreon account, which you can see on my Twitter thing, if it can help me do what I do here, because essentially I'm funded by my patrons. And I've written two books published this year, Killer in the Kremlin and Hunting Ghislaine, which is about Ghislaine Maxwell, which is a whole other thing. Josh, I've got to go, but thank you very much. And as we say here, Putin Huliar. Putin's a dickhead.
Oh, that's quite the sign off. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Take care.
Hey everyone. Thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.